Good question. Because, of course, in one book I could not include everything. And so, yes, I had to make choices. But then there are a lot of things that I left out because they needed to be left out. But the decision was, in order to create a coherent story that had a timeline and a direction that was believable. So one of the first things I had to do was to establish what was the mission statement for Jesus' ministry. What was he about? Why was he doing what he was doing? So this became a foundational plan in the book. What was his mission statement? And then the second thing, of course, is his own growth in understanding. His learning curve. Did Jesus have a learning curve? You mean he didn't know it all when he first began? No. He had to evolve his understanding of the calling that he was entering. That's a big part of that story. But beyond that, there was his own dedication, that as the understanding of his mission grew, and towards the end, as he saw where this was going to lead, namely the cross, so he had to make decision to continue. It was his free will that took him onwards. It wasn't like walking down a railway line with the lines just leading you where you needed to go. It was hard work for him. And we see this in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's in great distress. He says, take this cup from me. And then finally he says, not my will. Now listen to that. Not my will, but thine. And he accepts the whole thing. The other element that I had to think about and maybe use a degree of license was the nature of the opposition that grew against Jesus. And in the Gospels, it is referred to in very light terms. But when you think about the implications, then the opposition had to have been far more serious and have grown over a far greater time, and that the elements of disagreement were greater than breaking a few laws about the Sabbath, of healing somebody on the Sabbath, for heaven's sake, washing your hands and doing other things. There may well have been objection to any of these, and they would have been included in conversations and so on. But the serious growth of opposition to Jesus himself and what he was doing was driving something much, much more profound. This was evil on the hoof. This was evil on the march. And for that, I invented the person of Annas, who is indeed, historically, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, and who himself had been high priest and who had been fired by the Romans because he was such a murderous individual. He was more diabolical than the Romans could put up with. But the growth of the opposition to Jesus was over a period of several years. And the nature of that and why, well, because Jesus threatened them in some way. When you're dealing with power, you threaten the source of power, and you got a fight on your hands. Jesus says, throw this place down and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. He's referring to the temple. And he's referring to the whole process of salvation by animal sacrifice, for God's sake. It is that has to go, because you can't graft onto what? Onto that onto that consideration, that the notion, idea of animal sacrifice, you can't graft onto what he was teaching. And he said, you can't sew a new patch onto an old cloth. You can't put new wine into old bottles. You'd blow it apart. Right? So here is the way in which this was the way in which evil was born and began to oppose him, and ultimately brought about his death, encompassed his death. And so those are the elements, some of the elements that I followed in developing my story. They are the basic ways in which I think his story grew and evolved.